Can you all hear me? Am I getting through all right? Thank you very much. So, to start off, each of the armed forces has a full range of multidimensional roles for its employment and its operations. Each is distinctive and defined by its practical capabilities and its sphere of operations. While the multidimensional features may be clear to the beholder within a single service, when seen more broadly, they are also complementary, but when viewed as a whole, their roles may overlap or even open gaps between the efforts of the different services. In this, an understanding of the traditional core capabilities of each service is essential, but that understanding needs to be modified by an appreciation of the changing character of both warfare as well as the uses of military forces in operations other than war. The mechanisms for combining and coordinating multiple service roles in the multidimensional manner that may often come down to the issues of command and control, dealing with differing procedures or even terminology that one another service has in dealing with specific tasks. A key element in making such very complex organizations function cooperatively alongside each other is to educate officers who work in such joint environments to have a deeper and more sensitive appreciation of the mindsets, mythologies or methodologies, and even the myths of the other services. It sometimes turns out that individuals involved in this process have focused too narrowly on what one might call the hinges between the services and not fully appreciate the substantive scope or demands of the central issues that one service or another may focus upon. All services might face this problem, but how can we think about this from the perspective, from a naval perspective? What does a modern Navy do? The most basic and obvious answer is that navies are associated with what has come to be called the Maritime Domain, both in peace and in war, on matters of security, defense, fighting, movement, support, and projection of force that arise on, above, or below the surface of the seas, oceans, and waterways of the world. In this, it is distinctive from the traditional role of an army or on land. It is complementary to the functions of a Coast Guard, which operates in the same domain with a focus on the homeland security and border patrol issues. It is complementary to an Air Force that has its own interest focused above the surface of the Earth and even beyond into space. But it is also complementary with the mutual concern for the new cyber domain of security and defense matters. Navies are traditional expressions of an individual state, both in terms of actual exercise of national power and its symbolic expression of that power in both home and in distant seas. On the other hand, the fundamental underlying purpose of a Navy has always been to make the maritime areas safe and dependable avenues for one's own use and to prevent any enemy from using them to our own detriment. For that reason, the concept of the freedom of the seas has been a major one in naval history. In this fundamental role, navies have played an essential part in global economics. One can predict that they continue to do so as long as there is any danger to or need to protect important maritime routes and goods that pass on, over, or under the water-covered parts of our globe that make up the largest surface of our planet. Yet this understanding is sometimes seen only in the context of large battle fleets battling one another, or as they did in the Age of Sail, or as recently as the Second World War. While such things could happen, they seem a remote possibility today and in the future. It is interesting to note in the last 60 years since the end of World War II, the number of the world's navies has increased dramatically. Not all the new navies have remained small in this period, even if they are relatively new. Among others, both China and India's navies have begun, quote, the transition to eminence in the naval world with only half a century. Immediately after the end of the World War II, the authoritative Jane's fighting ships listed only 54 countries with navies. Currently, Jane's World Navies of 2015 lists more than 3 times that number, with 168 countries with navies of all different types. Like the United States, a good number of these countries have separate armed Coast Guard forces in addition to their navies, and these have become increasingly important in the modern world context. At the same time, the latest maritime trade statistics show that the seas are increasingly important to the global economy, and that the world shipping of seas is increasing and has already reached proportions that surpass all previous history. According to the 2015 report of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, more than 9.8 billion tons of merchandise were carried at sea, a rise of 3.4% over the previous year, and 4/5 of all world trade, and about 4/5 of all world trade are carried at sea. 40% of this tonnage originated in Asia and was carried to other parts of the globe. About 20% of it came from the Americas. In the same year, at the same time as the amount of cargo grew, the world's shipping fleet also grew by 3.5%, reaching a total of 1.75 billion deadweight tons. In addition, a significant departure from past practice, today the number of merchant ships under a particular national flag no longer expresses a direct relationship to that navy's involvement or that nation's involvement in maritime affairs. The structure and ownership of the world's merchant fleets have changed dramatically and already reflect the expansion of national business interests across the globe. For example, in the United States, on the United Nations' most recent list of the world's most important maritime countries, the United States has the world's 8th largest maritime fleet after Greece, Japan, China, Germany, Singapore, Korea, and Hong Kong. But 85.5% of the merchant vessels in which the Americans have controlling interests fly a foreign flag. The same pattern is followed by the top 3 merchant fleets. Greece has 74% and Japan 91% of her merchant fleets under a foreign flag, while Germany has nearly 90%. Among others, Iran has 77%. China is an exception among the top 6 with just 53% of its fleet under a foreign flag, while Brazil, ranking 18th on the list, has just 84% of her merchant fleet under a foreign flag. The global economy, as some think about it today, is all about the transformation of the way the world does business, and through the increasing use and speed of global scale communications, conductivity, commercial interdependence, collaboration, and market competition, which all converge to create for individuals, companies, and customers a cheaper, easier, more friction-free, and more productive way of life for people around the globe. Globalization means that industrial production, even from individual companies and traditional brand names that have long been sources of national pride, are no longer the product of just a single nation, but are produced through more economically and productively efficient cooperation and collaboration that combine local skill and concentrated specialization with competitive costs and large global markets. These are fundamental economic and world trade issues that have transformed the production of numerous familiar products and have changed on a daily basis. What we used to think of an industrial product of Europe, or more particularly England, Germany, or Sweden, or the United States, may now be owned by a multinational consortium of investors and business people from many countries with global economic reach, and may have component parts from a variety of Asian and Latin American countries that are assembled and marketed simultaneously in various parts of the world. As this goes on around us and continues to develop, we cannot help but make the mental leap and ask, what is the effect of globalization on a national brand, such as a navy? How does this bear on new naval concepts that come from the associated new security concerns and changes in procedures that we were some years ago labeled as transformation? If one is to think of the global economy in terms of an explicit or a tacitly agreed upon grand strategy for the nations of the world to pursue for their mutual benefit, then the first logical conclusion to be reached is that the kind of geopolitical division that divided the globe into warring camps and determined much of the history of the 20th century, as well as earlier centuries, might be avoided. This sort of activity is that sort of activity, as occurred earlier, is entirely out of step to the nature of the global economy. Such wars typically close off major parts of the globe from interactions with other parts and serve to promote and to perpetuate closed economic systems that cannot interact with one another to share in the practical and positive results the global economy produces. While the images of geopolitical warfare in the 20th century and before easily tend to dominate naval thought, the 20th century also provides the foundation upon which naval operations within the context of a global economy may be built. Our abstract understanding of naval strategic roles that has developed and changed over the course of the 20th century, and the historical record has left us to widen further our perception about naval roles. Above all, we see that the issue of naval strategic roles is not merely a question in abstract concepts among naval officers, but of concepts enmeshed in broader issues that range from grand strategy, bureaucracy, and finance to diplomacy and international law. On the naval operational level, that consideration of strategic roles must often be based on issues ranging from cooperation with other services to combat effectiveness in carrying out a broad strategic vision. When seen from the very broadest perspective, the importance of maritime affairs ebbs and flows in relation to the context of events. Within maritime affairs, context is everything in understanding, defining maritime strategic roles, particularly when the very nature of ships and aircraft forces them to undertake a variety of missions and duties. Yet because of the expansion of maritime interests among coastal states, as well as the very mobility of naval forces and their multidimensional capabilities and roles, the issues surrounding the strategic roles of armed force at sea continue to be important ones. The impact of noticeable change in so many areas, ranging from the development of the global economy, new developments in international law, and the character and effectiveness of weapons, to the joint service and multinational employment of naval forces, as well as the organizational and technological implications of coming through innovation. This all continues to stress the need to see conflict at sea and the strategic roles of maritime forces in the widest possible perspective. As in the times when major changes were taking place, the procedures of the past specifically appear to be irrelevant and outmoded. Yet a careful look at the old ideas and approaches helps to formulate new questions that need to be answered. The old answers can stimulate broad new approaches and new applications, suggesting useful insights. A broad look at the 20th century and its experience with changing strategic roles for navies suggests that the specific strategic roles for which a navy is built are often very different from the roles that they actually end up performing. The experience of the 20th century provides repeated evidence of this, as one contrasts the strategic roles that any major participant foresaw in the pre-war period with those actually carried out in the wars that followed. It was true at the Great Wars of 1914-18 and 1939-45, as well as the smaller wars of that century. Navies have many and often unexpected uses, but this truth serves to remind us that the naval strategy depends on an ever-changing context and involves what one side does in the calculus of what the other side wants to do and is actually able to do. At the second decade of the 20th century, where we are today, we can clearly see that just over 100 years of experience have fully borne out the fundamental distinctions that both Alfred Thayer Mahan and Sir Julian Corbett recognized for naval forces at the opening of the last century. But their thoughts need to be refined to meet modern concerns. Put in the broadest perspective that we use today, the fundamental strategic role for navies is to prevent any opponent from blocking the safe passage of any friendly craft on, over, or under the sea, and to block any force that interferes with such passage. If sea passage can be assured, if sea passage can be assured, an independent global economy dependent on the movement of global goods across the seas can continue to grow and to sustain peaceful world development. In a 21st century global economy, the safety of sea passage can no longer be defined in terms of the strategic role of a single nation's navy. It is a multilateral role that reflects the global concerns and the range of accepted, agreed, and customary practices among peoples and navies that form what we have come to call international law. Below that fundamental strategic role, there are secondary roles that flow from it. The strategic focus may be narrowed to a step downward and expressed in national terms, but the overriding global and international terms of reference restrict the degree to which any single nation may acceptably assume a controlling influence at sea. However, a nation that can assure safe passage for friendly commercial ships, as well as for friendly naval and military vessels, preventing interference from enemy forces, is in a position to defend itself as well as to provide and defend a secure passage for military forces and support them on a distant shore where they can assist allies or defend key places against the threats of the moment. At a third level, there is a series of supporting strategic naval roles in wartime that allow one to gain an essential position, either sequentially or cumulatively. It functions that facilitates the higher strategic functions. Such roles include reconnaissance, control of information, creation of political or economic pressure to help friends or hinder enemies. In periods of peace and in war, during the absence of direct hostilities, a perceived capability to carry out such strategic roles in wartime creates the basis for political perceptions in either friends or enemies. The epilogue to the 20th century is as yet unknown, but if one reads the known prologue as it played out in the 20th century and in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, one observes that the initial indications of that course. One of the major characteristics is the changing character of warfare during the past 15 years that has stretched beyond the traditional core competencies of each service. As one former Army officer famously observed, the product was learning to eat soup with a knife. Later, as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have produced, another scholar put it this way: a failure to understand the interaction of the conflict's microdynamics with patronage struggles over power and resources at the center meant that the actions of allies often played into and contributed to the entrenchment of violent and exploitive political economies in perverse and unintended ways. One finds that in these new contexts, maritime forces will need the material and intellectual resources to meet the unexpected and be able to shift from one strategic role to another in terms of whatever context appears, and to understand with greater depth and sensitivity the local political nature that drives the conflicts and problems they face. If the leading naval trends that appear in the second half of the 20th century continue to develop, the naval history of the 21st century will be a story of both large nations and small, great powers and littoral states cooperatively carrying out multilateral, joint, and combined operations at sea to maintain international order while working closely with the other armed services. The realization of this broad vision would affect navies in two ways. First, in terms of an important strategic object of grand strategy toward which naval operations can contribute, and second, in terms of the logistical and organizational means and methods through which a navy sustains its efficiency. If the global economy were to be taken as the object of future grand strategy, its intended purpose would be to contribute to the betterment of the human condition around the globe through the latest means provided by modern communications, economic diversity, competing markets, and increased efficiency in work and production. To be successful, such a strategy must carefully nurture economic, cultural, ethnic, and national diversities, as these are the characteristics that provide for the fundamental differences in regions, markets, and workplaces that are the engines for a successful global economy. At the same time, certain types of commonalities in business procedures and approaches must necessarily be developed and sustain to permit and promote an effective and increasingly efficient global economy. This move toward commonality in some areas may well be fraught with some difficulty, if it is seen as a subjugation of traditional values, work opportunities, and products in foreign ideas, labors, and means. These changes toward certain types of commonality should conceivably be limited to business procedures and to communications in ways that would not undermine the more fundamental differences that form the driving forces of the global economy. Stress of this nature, arising from economic forces and perceived ethnic and cultural values, might become a source of regional tension, as we've already seen, that could affect global economics and balance. These and other types of fragmentation of an international cooperative and collaborative market economy would become the fundamental international security issue. In talking about the nature of security interests in a global world economy, the most fundamental maritime issue would clearly be to maintain the safe and free uses of the sea for commerce and international economic communication and exchange. In the modern age, we can no longer think of this in the terms of just the traditional use of ocean services. The undersea regions, sea bottom, and skies above the waterways have now become essential and interrelated aspects. The issues are not just naval ones, although they deeply concern navies. This line of thinking reaches beyond inter-service cooperation toward international cooperation. For navies, the issues at hand lead one to think in broad terms that encompasses all aspects of mankind's relationships with the world's oceans. The most proper adjective to describe that wider range of issues is the word maritime. One of the major developments of the late 20th century that provides a beginning for thinking about maritime security in a global context now and in the future is the results of the Third United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982. This agreement, now very widely accepted among the world's nations, lays out some key concepts. First, it lays out a geographical basis for each nation to understand the ocean, areas for which it has a regional responsibility in terms of the 12-mile coastal waters, the continental shelf, the waters surrounding offshore island dependencies, and beyond that, its extended economic zone for the protection of offshore maritime resources. In addition, it attempts to resolve the many specific and knotty questions involving the rights of international passage in narrow waters in which one or more countries have an interest, thus providing approaches to defuse conflicts over claims and rights within sea areas, but at the same time serving to lay out limits of national responsibility for regulation. These are very helpful insofar as they take basic practical steps to providing some relevant fundamentals, but future practice and uses will need to develop further in the realm of international law of the sea to regulate the emerging and larger issues of the global economy itself. What we do have, however, helps to empower the coastal state in the role of managing its own maritime resources. Coastal power is local, not global, but it clearly has an effect on global maritime issues. Coastal navies build their navies with specific attuned equipment and training for a particular range of tasks necessary to a specific and limited geographical area. They are ready to operate and, if necessary, fight in a very different circumstances and ways than naval fleets designed for distant transoceanic work. Such navies may well be hard-pressed to win an old-fashioned sea fight with a larger navy, but their purposes are different and focused on helping to avert a war, prevent a crisis, and stabilize national control over ports, local maritime resources, and safe passage within their own areas. At the same time, these local navies have the potential for cooperation with the world's largest navies by being able, through the very available structures of cooperative relations and conditions, to provide specialized naval knowledge, techniques, and equipment in times of crisis, as well as long-term stabilization. Such attributes are means of key importance to naval roles in a global economy. Thus, small and medium-sized navies can have, in addition to their independent roles, new and particularly important roles to play in partnership with large and superpower navies. In order to support an established and growing global economy, the principal naval focus will not be on the traditional concept, one set of powers gaining command of the sea by defining a naval or rival coalition whose purpose is to establish a rival political and economic system for the world or a major partner. In a global economy, there would be no economic dimension that would require a modern battle like Trafalgar. Nevertheless, the example of Horatio Nelson's leadership, prescience, and sacrifice in that event, along with the determination, professional skill, and hardened experience that he and his sailors showed, will always remain an icon to professionals the world over. Such epic battles are so dramatic and such towering events in naval history as we have understood in that some people have trouble imagining what the role of a navy could be if such battles cannot be envisaged as a credible potential reality. Yet the last great event occurred in 1944, just over 70 years ago, and navies have very profitably employed otherwise since that time, giving us pause to think further about that topic. For the security of global world economy, one must think somewhat differently about the central role that emerges from classical naval theory. In that body of literature, naval battles were one means to achieve command of the sea. And Sir Julian Corbett defined command of the sea nearly a century ago in 1911. He said that it means nothing more than the control of maritime communication, whether for communication or military purposes. No one country, not even a superpower, can begin to provide this fully. This year, my own Naval War College and professional home, the U.S. Naval War College, celebrates the 60th anniversary of the 1956 establishment of the Naval Command College. This far-seen initiative has done much to build closer relationships between the current and future leaders of the world's navies. Its educational contribution is one of mutual understanding, work toward global stability, and thus in itself is a kind of initiative that is essential for what we have come to call the age of the global economy. Following on from this first step in the professional educational field, NATO created the first viable example of an operational multinational force in its standing naval force Atlantic. At its outset in 1968, many naval leaders of that era thought it too idealistic and functionally impossible for large, medium, and small navies to work together in any sort of useful, practical, or effective way. Certainly, there were serious strains, but practice proved that it is not only possible, but also continued to be very successful. It has now been extended to other operational groups in the Channel, the Mediterranean, and has served as a model outside the NATO context. These keys in this success were found in standardized logistics, standardized communication procedures, equipment, and standardized operational doctrine. The cumulative insight has been shown in recent years in the multilateral naval operations in the Adriatic and more recently in the Afghanistan and Iraq operations. Adding another dimension that builds directly on these two initiatives was the creation in 1969 of the International Sea Power Symposium. These biennial meetings were the first in which chiefs of naval staff and heads of the world's senior professional naval colleges could meet with their counterparts from around the world. Just last month, the 22nd meeting of the International Sea Power took place in Newport. In the 36 years since the beginning of the series of symposium, a key number of developments have grown from them. First is the development of regional symposium and discussions of regional cooperative naval initiatives that have been direct spin-offs from the International Sea Power Symposium, which had first inspired the approach of using regional discussions as part of its agenda. Second is the initiative of a manual for multilateral naval operations that could be used beyond the NATO arena. All these initiatives in the fields of education, multinational cooperation, and multinational operational art are in top-level political discussions, professional discussions, not political, are strong foundations for what we will need to be developed further. The very sinews of the global economy are transoceanic communication, transport, and shipping. In a truly global world economy, national security, most particularly the naval component involved, must be a shared effort with other nations. This observation leads us back to the point where the discourse began, the global economy and the military functions of navies. In the modern age, it has become important, even essential, to think about maritime forces, Navy, Coast Guard, and amphibious forces in their joint context, alongside the other national armed forces, the Army and the Air Force. That is a very important task. But in the course of doing this, we must first understand that a Navy is different from the other services, which is the very reason one needs to think of navies in complementary ways to other services, rather than in identical terms. That is not to say that the Navy is more important, just that it is different and performs different functions in different ways within a different medium. Of the various kinds of military forces, land, air, and maritime, only navies have the ready and established ability to be both weapons in war and benign elements in peace. One of the essential differences between what an army might do and what a navy might do in peacetime is that navies do not need to intrude on sovereign territory to carry out their mission effectively. This is a fundamental feature of the maritime presence of naval forces. As the great naval theorist J.C. Wiley once wrote, the almost indefinable quality of maritime presence, subtle, benign, ubiquitous presence, actual or potential presence, is the great asset of sea power in times of peace and ever in times of one or another variety of tension. This quality of actual or even potential maritime presence everywhere around the world is the quality that sets navies apart from armies and air forces and is as the employments short of war. This worldwide and benign ubiquity, this subtle evidence of naval and national strength is what makes the other nationally benign elements of national strength when extended overseas. Wiley's point is fundamental in considering the global economy and the military function of navies. The military object of naval operation is to ensure some degree of effective control at sea. In this sense, the control must be economic, political, or psychological, or it may range from complete control to a range of influences that can either be felt immediately or have long-range term effect. In terms of a world economy, that means that the primary role to prevent anarchy at sea, ensuring law and order for the safe passage of peaceful shipping across the open oceans, has its ports of origin beyond coastal waters and local extended economic zones, so that it's worldwide destination. In such a world, one can anticipate that among the most typical forms of naval operations will be naval blockade, a primal type of naval operation, but one that has until recently been very little studied. Conducted in the context of maritime coalitions, another fundamental dimension that has often been ignored. These kinds of core competency naval operations in the open sea are linked to and extended from the separate national police activities inside coastal waters. Multinational maritime cooperation operations may be effectively empowered to deal with emerging military threats to economic stability and international exchange of raw goods and manufactured products. These threats may be on the open sea in the form of piracy or illegal maritime trade. Alternatively, as military threats or actions that disrupt the equilibrium of the global economy. They may require access and intervention ashore. Such coalitions are also effective in dealing with humanitarian relief operations, as was seen in the 2005 tsunami in the Indian Ocean and the 2011 tsunami in Japan. Such a wide range of operations may well result in more carefully defined, even mutually agreed upon, national specialization in naval roles, as vision and understanding broaden to see more clearly an individual Navy's role within a broader global context. Thank you very much.